People love The Mandalorian for many reasons, whether it's the gritty action, the wacky side characters, or the heart-melting moments with Baby Yoda. There is plenty to love about this TV series. So much, in fact, that nobody is talking about one of the key ingredients to the show's success. And that ingredient is how the writers make their anti-hero likable. And the way they do it is by fleshing out their main character at the midpoint of each episode. If you've never heard of the midpoint, don't worry. Today I'll explain what it is and how it functions, and I'll be using The Mandalorian as a teaching example. Just to be clear, I'll be focusing on episodes 3 through 6, so consider that your spoiler warning. Now, the midpoint is not to be confused with what you learned in high school geometry class. That's not the midpoint we're talking about. Rather, what we're looking at is a plot point that occurs around the 50% mark of a story. That's where it happens, but locating the midpoint isn't enough. We need to understand how it functions in a story and what is its purpose. Now, unfortunately for writers, defining the midpoint can be tricky because there are so many definitions out there. For instance, the popular screenwriting guide Save the Cat describes the midpoint as a false victory or a false defeat. And this means that your heroes will probably have some success here. Maybe they win a battle or they find something they were searching for. But because there's still another half to your story, you can't have a complete victory or a complete defeat here. Save the Cat also suggests that the stakes are raised at the midpoint, meaning that your protagonist should have more to gain and more to lose at this point in the story. Another writing guide called Story Engineering suggests that the midpoint should do other things as well. In this book, Larry Brooks says the midpoint should reveal new information, and this can be something like a villain's plan or an important piece of character backstory, something that changes our understanding of the story and causes the characters to shift their focus. Brooks also says that the protagonist should go from being reactive to proactive at this point, meaning that instead of having your story drag the main character around like it does in the first half, that character should now go on the attack and actively pursue a goal. Then there's one more definition, and this one comes from James Scott Bell. In his book, Write Your Novel from the Middle, he describes the midpoint as a moment where a character is forced to look at himself and ask himself questions like, who am I and who do I want to become? This, to me, is the most important definition of the midpoint, and that's because most stories are about character change. Usually in the first half of a story, the main character is flawed and causing problems as a result of that flaw. Then, at the midpoint, they often have a moment of clarity. They reflect on who they are, and then they take that first step toward becoming a different person. The third episode of The Mandalorian is a great example of this. In the first half, Mando returns to his employer to drop off Baby Yoda and collect his payment. When he hands over the kid, he asks what will happen to the child, but he doesn't get a satisfying answer. Eventually, Mando returns to his ship with a new job, but right as he's about to take off, he has a moment of midpoint clarity. He notices that one of the knobs on his ship's control panel has been removed by the child. And this is a touching moment for both the audience and for Mando, who reflects on his time with Baby Yoda and ultimately decides to save the kid from his client. This is a moment of high emotional impact, and in my opinion, this is where the show went from being good to great. Also notice here that Mando not only chooses to be a better person at this midpoint, he also goes on the attack after being relatively passive up till then. Episode 4 follows a similar pattern. Here we see Mando and Baby Yoda seeking out a planet where they can lay low. They end up settling near a village where the locals have recently been attacked by raiders. These villagers request Mando's help, but at first he's reluctant to get involved. And by the way, am I the only one who got a Seven Samurai vibe from this episode? Let me know in the comments below if you were thinking the same thing. Anyway, after agreeing to help the locals, Mando realizes that he's up against more than just bandits. Turns out that the bad guys have an Imperial walker, and Mando ends up suggesting that everyone should just pack up and leave. But when the locals explain how much the village means to them, Mando has another moment of midpoint clarity. He decides to help them, and his motivation has a lot to do with his own past and how he was once a child growing up in a war zone. That motivation humanizes the man beneath the helmet, and it makes us like him a lot lot more. Now, the midpoint in episode 5 doesn't have significant impact like the previous two, but that's okay. Not every midpoint needs to build a heavy emotional connection between the audience and main character. Sometimes it's enough just to show off how a character operates. If you remember in this episode, Mando teams up with a wannabe bounty hunter to catch an assassin. At the midpoint, Mando discovers the assassin's latest victim, and he is soon attacked himself. This particular moment doesn't show Mando making any heavy decisions, but we do witness his bounty hunter skills on display, particularly his ability to strategize in the face of danger. It's also worth noting that he shifts from search mode to attack mode, and thus becomes proactive. You can also argue that the midpoint here is a small victory, seeing as they locate their target and can now finish the job. These examples show how the midpoint can push your character in a new, meaningful direction. When it comes to anti-heroes, writers often have to do extra legwork to keep the audience invested. Even in episode 6, the writers of The Mandalorian still use the midpoint to remind us why we should care about Mando. They do this by showing how Mando's moral code shines in comparison to the moral codes of those other mercenaries that he teams up with. Whether you realize it or not, moments like these are what keep audiences coming back week after week after week. So the next time you're enjoying a story, pay attention near the 50% mark. Keep an eye out for a false victory, a revelation, or a shift toward character change. And ask yourself if you're beginning to like the main character more. If that's the case, chances are the writers did their job. Thank you for watching, and if you're interested in picking up any of the books I mentioned in this video, check the links in the description below. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and if you don't mind, share this video with a friend. And as always, if you are a writer, remember to keep on writing.